And I only figured that out by writing about it. I wrote about it in my journal in college. And then I had conversations with some of these women, and I said, well, what does your dad do for a living? And they would tell me. What does your mom do? And say, well, she plays a lot of bridge, and she's very bored, and she takes a lot of medications for her depression and so forth. And so only gradually did I learn about these things, and I came to understand them more deeply by writing about them. And that was why I wrote about them. I wasn't writing about them because I thought I would one day publish an essay called The Men We Carry in Our Minds. I was writing about them because I wanted to understand more deeply. And in similar ways, I've written about race, which is still to me a source of grief and shame. The racial divides in this country, the racial history in this country, and the ongoing agony suffered because of racism and the history of slavery in this country. And I've written about that. My father was from Mississippi. I was actually born in Memphis. I was 5 years old when I moved away. But I've always felt implicated in the much more overt forms of racism in the South. The North has got plenty of racism of its own, but it tends to be more subtle than it has historically been in the South. So I've written about race. I've written a lot about religion or spiritual searching, spiritual seeking. When I went to college, I had come from a very traditional Methodist church, rural church upbringing. I was a very pious boy, probably unpleasantly so. I had read the Bible the way I read other books. I just started at the first page and read to the last page and then read it again. And of course I didn't understand 95% of it. Didn't know any of the historical context. I didn't know what a lot of the individual words meant because I started reading it when I was 8 or 9. But I was a very churchy boy. And when I went to college for the first time, I met people who had not been raised in any religious tradition at all. I met people who were Jewish. I met people who were Hindu, who were Muslim, although many fewer people, students in universities in the U.S. were Muslim in the 1960s than is the case now. And I realized in college, encountering people from all these different traditions, that I came to be convinced that there's no one right, true way to understand our place in the universe and the meaning of life. There are many ways. Humans have puzzled about what it means to be human, what it means to be mortal. The two things we know about ourselves is that we're born and that we die. And everything else is a mystery. And this mystery has intrigued humans as long as humans have recognized the fact of our mortality and the scale of the universe. So in college, one of the most powerful encounters I had, analogous to the encounters with women who came from very different class backgrounds and therefore thought about gender roles very differently than I did, was encountering people who came from very different religious backgrounds or backgrounds that had no religious dimension at all. I didn't know anybody when I was a boy growing up who wasn't a member of a church. May have been a very disgruntled member of a church, but was a member somewhere. The other encounter I had in university that challenged my religious preconceptions, my religious vision, was science itself. Because science has given us all human beings, over the ages, a more and more rich, huge story of the origins and evolution of the universe. And as I studied physics and studied cosmology, it was harder and harder for me to reconcile the religious vision, the religious stories I learned as a boy and young man, both in church and in home and from Bible reading, it was harder and harder for me to reconcile those with the scientific vision of the world that I was learning through classes in university, but also just through my own reading of science. So that's another subject that I wrote about. I wrote about it in my journal in college. I wrote about it years afterwards. And a number of the essays in Earthworks are about that effort to articulate a connection between a scientific vision of the universe and a spiritual vision of the universe. I believe that they can be reconciled. I don't think it's easy to do it. I think it's necessary to do it because the scientific vision of the universe, which includes evolution, it includes right now the awareness that humans are disrupting the climate. It includes thousands upon thousands of discoveries that have been made in every country on the planet. Science is this great cooperative house of knowledge that has been built and is being built right now by people in Kentucky and people in Taipei and people in Timbuktu. All over the planet, scientists are enlarging this house of knowledge. And to deny ourselves access to that, as many people in the United States do, to say it's scary or it threatens certain beliefs I have, is to deprive ourselves of one of the great creations of humankind, collective creations of humankind, the body of scientific knowledge. Again, literature, the reading of literature, but also the writing of literature, my own literature, has helped me to incorporate insights from science into my own spiritual vision of the world. I'm going to read you just a couple of pieces from Earthworks that illustrate other kinds of discoveries I made through writing. The first one is from the essay called At Play in the Paradise of Bombs. As I say in the essay, I spent formative years of childhood from about age 5 to about age 10 or 11 in a military reservation in northeastern Ohio called the Ravenna Arsenal. It's a place that was constructed during the Second World War to manufacture munitions, bombs and howitzer shells and bazooka shells for the U.S. military to use in World War II. And my father was moved there by the company he worked for after World War II, actually during the Korean War, when I was 5 years old, and that's what carried us to Ohio. And I explored this place as a kid in a completely uncritical, context-free way, meaning I had no real, this was simply the world to me. I didn't realize how strange it was to have tanks in your backyard and to have explosions every night from the ammunition dump when they were getting rid of old explosives. I didn't realize how strange that was. Or to see herds of deer, literally herds of deer, like it would be cattle in these fences. So when I was living there, what I was experiencing went very deep in me, but it wasn't until years later, and it wasn't until I really wrote about it, as in this essay, that I understood the impact of growing up in such a place. Because what it was, what this arsenal was, and it's no longer a military base, but it's a place that's used by the Ohio and I think Kentucky National Guard for training programs. What it was a place where the encounter between nature and the most powerful forms of human technology, warfare, where those two things collided. And I grew up right in between that collision. On the one hand, the technology infatuated me as a boy. Like a lot of children, and maybe more boys even than girls, I was fascinated by big, loud, powerful machines as a little boy. And this place was full of them. But I was also fascinated by frogs and Bald eagles. This place had bald eagles. It had beaver. It had raccoons. It had red foxes. It had coyotes. It was the closest thing in Ohio to wilderness, because the parts of the arsenal that were not actually munitions factories or bunkers full of munitions, those places had been let go. So here's the end of that essay, just the last half paragraph At Play in the Paradise of Bombs. During the years I spent inside the chain link fences, almost every night at supper time, outdated bombs would be detonated at the ammo dump. The concussion rattled the milk glass and willow ware in the corner cupboard, rattled the forks against our plates, and the cups against our teeth. It was like the muttering of local gods, a reminder of who ruled our neighborhood. From the moment I understood what those explosions meant, what small sparks they were of the engulfing fire, I lost my appetite. But even outside the arsenal, a mile or an ocean away, every night at supper time, my fork still stuttered against the plate. My teeth still chattered from the remembered explosions. They still do. Everywhere now, there are bunkers beneath the humped green hills. Electronic challenges and threats needle through the air we breathe. The last wild beasts fling themselves against our steel boundaries. The fences of the arsenal have stretched outward until they encircle the entire planet. I feel now I can never move outside. Now that's pretty dark, but unfortunately it's pretty accurate. That is, we, not just America, but we collectively as humans have militarized the planet. I grew up at a time when we were keenly aware of the existence of nuclear weapons. They were being tested in the atmosphere that is above ground until I was about age 15 or 16, until the Russians and the Americans agreed to only test underground. But there were then, and there still are now, thousands of nuclear warheads, a handful of which could actually end life on Earth, at least human life at a civilized level on Earth. And we grew up with a keen awareness of that. The fact is still there. The weaponry is still there. And the power to use it is concentrated in Moscow and Washington. That hasn't changed. The level of awareness, we tend to worry more about other things now, more about environmental things, and certainly there are very worrisome environmental trends. But for me as a boy, the existence of nuclear weapons and the realization that 2 or 3 people in either capital could decide at any moment to start a war that would end civilization, that was terrifying, still is terrifying. You probably have heard of duck and cover. One of the things the U.S. government did in the 50s when I was in elementary school, and the early 60s when I was in high school, one of the things they did to placate Americans who were worried about nuclear weapons was to give programs in schools about how you could survive a nuclear blast. And so we would have these drills which were called duck and cover. All of a sudden the teacher would clap her hands or a voice would come on over the loudspeaker, and we would all duck down and get against the outside wall and put hands over our heads. And this was supposed to defend us from a nuclear blast. And a few years after that, I saw films of locations within miles of the nuclear tests where things were just vaporized. Buildings were vaporized, brick buildings, stone buildings were just vaporized. And we kids were supposed to protect ourselves from nuclear blasts by putting hands over our heads. And the Russians did something very similar, but it was a propaganda campaign against the American people by the American government to persuade us that it's okay that we keep building more and more of these weapons, and that we have a policy of a willingness to use it against other people. Not first use, but second use. So if we're fired on, If we're vaporized, we'll vaporize the others, and we'll just basically abolish life on Earth.